And welcome in again to Bucks Courtside Live. I'm Justin Garcia here with you as Bucks getting set to host James Harden and the Houston Rockets. Big showdown for the players you see on the floor there. Getting it out of the way, obviously, the matchup of Giannis and James Harden, the two likely MVP candidates, two most likely MVP candidates. Very good chance one of these two players takes home that hardware in June. And two teams that are really coming on strong. I mean, especially in the case of the Houston Rockets, looking back at the start they got off to this season and where they are now. Third seed in the Western Conference, a half game in front of the Portland Trail Blazers, who suffered a devastating injury last night, by the way, that gruesome leg injury to Jusuf Nurkic. So the Rockets hold that half-game advantage, but that's a big blow to Portland. So a good chance to hold off the Blazers for one of those top three seeds, and 3 games behind the Denver Nuggets for the 2 seeds. So 2 not out of the realm of possibility, though a lot of work to be put in, but still not out of the realm of possibility for the Houston Rockets. As for the Bucks, still that top seed in the East and all of basketball. And now, as we mentioned, it's becoming more and more of a formality that they're going to wrap up that top seed. 4 games up on the Toronto Raptors, basically 5 by way of owning that tiebreaker, and top seed in all of basketball as well. As you look at the Western Conference, Golden State Warriors right now your leader at 50-23, putting the Bucks 4.5 games in front of them. So the magic number to clinch the top seed in the East for the Bucks is 4. Any combination of Bucks victories or Raptors losses will do that. The Raptors in action tonight, playing the Chicago Bulls at home. And Raptors, last time out there, as we saw, that tough loss to the Charlotte Hornets on that buzzer beater, half-court buzzer beater by Jeremy Lamb. That did a couple of things. Number one, as we just pointed to, move the Bucks closer to the top overall seed in the East in all of basketball. It also kept Charlotte's playoff hopes alive as you look at the Eastern Conference. 6, 7, 8 right now, the Pistons, Brooklyn Nets, and Miami Heat. Just 1 game separates those 3 teams. So any combination of those are going to be 6, 7, 8. You do have the Orlando Magic, Charlotte Hornets, and Washington Wizards all still alive for the postseason. Let's look at the Washington Wizards first. 6.5 games behind the Miami Heat right now for the 8th seed. So very, very long odds for the Washington Wizards to reach the postseason at 30-44, 6.5 games back with 8 games remaining. You basically need to win out and to get a lot of help as they're 7 back in the loss column. Charlotte Hornets, we mentioned that victory that they had against Toronto on that buzzer beater. That keeps them alive, just 2 games back of the Heat for the 8th seed. And the Magic, just 1 game back. A couple of interesting games to keep an eye on, as I think there is some intrigue for that 8th spot in the Eastern Conference, just to figure out who it is that the Bucks likely are going to play in the postseason. But that's 8. As we mentioned, 6 and 7 right now, tied with the Brooklyn Nets and Detroit Pistons. 37-36 for the Pistons, 38-37 for the Nets. They're 17.5 games behind the Bucks for the top seed. 4-5 is where the intrigue starts to pick up. Boston Celtics still the 5 seed, and they are 2 games back of the Pacers by way of a 4-game losing streak recently. So the Pacers have clinched. Celtics have still yet to clinch a playoff berth. Looking at the playoffs overall, top 4 in the East have clinched. Top 4 in the West have clinched. Bucks, Raptors, Sixers, and Pacers in the East. In the West, Warriors, Nuggets, Rockets, who we're seeing tonight, and the Blazers, as we just mentioned, that injury to Jusuf Nurkic. But as we just pointed to, there are some very, very intriguing matchups on the schedule, not necessarily tonight, but in the coming days here. Certainly this one, biggest game of the night, the Bucks and the Rockets, the 2 very likely MVP candidates here, most likely MVP candidates, 2 teams in the top 3 in their respective conferences, 55 wins for the Bucks, 47 wins for the Houston Rockets. You had the first matchup this season that the Bucks won in Houston, and the defensive job they did on James Harden, even though the box score may indicate otherwise. You look at what they did defensively, that duo of Eric Bledsoe and Brook Lopez, and the way Bledsoe defended James Harden on the perimeter, forced him to go to his right, basically, and having Brook Lopez, as we've seen all season long, drop back to defend the rim and in the basket and the paint. That defense certainly seemed to be helpful for the Bucks. Seemed to do a number on James Harden despite a 40-point effort in that game. Made him work for it. I know it's tough to say something was a good defensive effort when an individual player goes off for 40 or more, but a very good defensive effort, all things considered, against James Harden. Certainly expect to see more of the same tonight in the way that the Bucks elected to defend Harden in the first matchup. And James Harden, what more can you say about him? Obviously, the 30-point streak that he had going earlier this season, second longest in NBA history, trailing only Wilt Chamberlain and what he did multiple times with those 30 points or more. But 36 points, 6.5 rebounds, 7.5 assists per game, 36.5 points. The points per game that James Harden has put up, and this is what makes the MVP discussion so interesting. It's almost like if you go back to the James Harden and Russell Westbrook debate when James Harden was leading the Rockets, putting up similar numbers, not quite 36 per game, and you had Russell Westbrook on his triple-double streak. You're seeing a lot of the same here, where what both of these players have done this season, Giannis and James Harden, if you're looking at only the point-per-game numbers, what they're both doing has not been done in the NBA before. For James Harden, 36 in the amount of rebounds and assists per game while scoring 36 a night has not been done. Same for Giannis at 27, basically 13 rebounds and 6 assists, the steals, the blocks, all of it. We haven't seen anyone put up stat lines like that. But James Harden, 36.4 points per game right now. We point that number out a lot because that is the most that an individual has put up in an NBA season since Michael Jordan back in the 86-87 season. So it's been quite some time that we've seen an individual performance like this on a nightly basis. And a lot of the reason why the injuries that the Houston Rockets dealt with earlier this season, where James Harden basically had to do that for his team to keep his team afloat. So that's a big reason why you're seeing that production from James Harden. But again, just look at his last 2 games and what he's entering off of here. The last 3 games, 57 points against the Memphis Grizzlies in a loss last week on Wednesday night, and 61 against the Spurs on Friday night. So no current 30-point streak, as he just had 28 points last time on the floor Sunday in a victory on the road against the New Orleans Pelicans. But 61 and 57 in back-to-back games less than a week ago here for James Harden. So he certainly has it rolling so far this season. And, again, a big reason why the Rockets are in the position that they are in right now to be one of the top potentially 3, maybe even 2 seeds in the Western Conference in an MVP type of campaign here for James Harden this season. So that's what you're getting from James Harden. That's what you're getting from the Beard. As we mentioned, too, we saw the way the Bucks elected to defend him in the first matchup earlier this season when they won on the road in Houston, and that seemed to pay off for the Bucks. So as we pointed to, I would expect much of the same tonight. We gave you those numbers from James Harden, though, mentioning what Giannis has done. So we point to the 36 that James Harden is putting up. Keep in mind, Giannis has only played 32 minutes a game this season. So if you look at their per 36 numbers, which is what you essentially assume these players will be playing, and James Harden has played more than 36 minutes a game, but 36 is what you look to a lot because you're going to see that or more in the postseason. Giannis's per 36 numbers, 30 points per game, almost 7 assists, and nearly 14 rebounds per game. So if you look at it by per 36, Giannis's numbers even greater, and really the only area where he trails James Harden, 6 fewer points per game. Harden's numbers actually come down slightly looking at the per 36 because, as we pointed to, he's played more than 36 minutes a game this season. So that's the marquee matchup that you have tonight, Giannis and James Harden. But to the other player that you're looking at now, Chris Middleton, I do want to share some numbers on him and what he has done recently for this team. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to drop those here as you're watching along on Facebook. You can tweet those in as well. We welcome your questions here for today's show. We'll hear from Coach Mike Budenholzer in approximately 5 minutes. Also be joined by Eric Name of The Athletics shortly after that and catch up with him to get his thoughts on this matchup for sure, the Bucks' health as they move into the postseason, and really how this team is approaching these final few weeks, because the question has been asked to Coach Budenholzer quite a few times on how do you approach these weeks knowing this team almost has that 1 seed locked up. Number one, how important is that? But two, how do you manage rest here? Because we've heard Coach Bud point out a couple of times, you don't want to just go into shutdown mode here in advance of the playoffs and kind of have guys have to hit the ground running. That's something we touched on with Steve Novak a couple of days ago. It's pretty tough to go from shutdown to now it's the playoffs, get out there and go even harder than we've seen in the regular season. So we'll ask those to Eric Name. If you have any questions for Eric Name of The Athletic as well, feel free to leave those in the comments here on Facebook. And as we mentioned, any questions or comments in general, feel free to drop those along as well. But you see Giannis and Chris Middleton out there getting warmed up here for tonight's game. Chris Middleton just moments ago, the embrace with John Lucas, who certainly, the work that he has done, a member here of the Houston Rockets staff, but the work that John Lucas has done with a handful of players in this league, certainly worth pointing out there. So some ties to this city as well, as John Lucas, a former member of the Bucks. So good to see John Lucas in the building. But Chris Middleton, looking at what Chris Middleton has done since the All-Star break, ever since returning from then, Chris Middleton on the season averaging about 18 points per game. Since returning from the All-Star game, more than 20 points per game, but the most important, 44% from the field, 39% from three-point, and along with those 20 points per game, 7 rebounds and basically 5 assists per game. 60% of his threes have been assisted since the All-Star break as well. It was about 50 before the break. And the other part is less of his two-point shots have come through an assist. Before the All-Star break, it was more than 30. Since it's 20. So that goes along with what we kind of pointed out the other day. You've seen Mike Budenholzer basically concede portions of the mid-range game that we've touched on multiple times early in the season, how that was the big part of the offense that we saw go away from last year to this year. That wasn't part of Bud's system here. And you saw Chris Middleton as one of the guys that really thrived in the mid-range game. I think what you've seen in spurts this season is Coach Budenholzer's willingness to let Chris Middleton or others go back to that if need be. And it seems to be what gets Chris Middleton going, and I think those numbers we just gave you there with the assisted threes and assisted twos would certainly reference that. But again, since the All-Star break, 20 points, more than 20 points per game, 7 rebounds, basically 5 assists, and he's 44% from the field, basically 40% from three-point. And I know this next one is a small sample size, but it's most encouraging because people will point to when the Bucks need him most or when you need this the most, which let's keep in mind, these are still regular season games, so it's tough to say you need anything the most right now in the regular season opposed to the playoffs. But since the Malcolm Brogdon injury occurred and since the Bucks needed some more production from players across the board, Chris Middleton has really shined. In those 5 games, the average is up to 22 points per game. He's shooting 51% from the field, 42% from 3, and 8.5 rebounds, 5 assists per game, 3 double-doubles in those 5 games, too, 3 straight. He had never had back-to-back double-doubles, and he just had 3 in a row in a stretch last week. And, the numbers off the assists, too, 50% of his threes have been assisted, 35% of his twos have been assisted. So really, in that gap between the All-Star break and the injury to Malcolm Brogdon in mid-March, you've seen Chris Middleton fit into the system a lot better. And that's not to say that this whole team, that it doesn't fit, but what you've seen that's most encouraging is Chris Middleton. Similar to what we saw in the postseason last year, Chris Middleton has really stepped up, and his offense has started to come to life here as we move towards the postseason. And if you can get the same production you got from Chris Middleton in the postseason last year in that series against the Boston Celtics where he was basically unguardable, you could make an argument over who was the better offensive player on the floor during that series. Was it Chris Middleton or was it Giannis? If you get that again, you really have to, not that you struggle to find reasons to like the Bucks' chances as it is, but you get that production, you really like where the Bucks are headed moving into the postseason. I mentioned we will hear from Coach Budenholzer in just a couple of moments here. We expect him momentarily, and Eric Name will join us after we hear from Coach Budenholzer. A couple of fans chiming in already on Facebook with their excitement. Let's go Bucks, big game tonight. A couple of other notes to pass along here, though, from the win over the weekend on Sunday. 55 wins on the season now. 42 of those have been by double figures. 12 of them have been by 20 or more this season for the Bucks, which just speaks to the dominance. They have 55 wins, but to have nearly all of those, 42 of their 55 wins, nearly 80% of your wins are coming by double figures. And that goes back to what one of the major talking points was of going back to that 76ers game or going back to the Pacers game that was on TNT, where there was talk of, was this arena quiet? Keep in mind, Pacers game, Bucks enter that game off of 2 victories. This arena continues to be very loud, one of the loudest in the NBA. You hear the players talk about it. But how many games have been close here at Fiserv Forum? We talked about this on the broadcast on Sunday as well. Really, the only buzzer beater you can think of is that loss to the Phoenix Suns, where Chris Middleton just missed getting it off in time on that corner 3 that would have beat the Suns. Instead, it's Phoenix coming away with a victory on that game-winning shot from Jamal Crawford. So most of these games that the Bucks have won, especially here at home, have been blowouts. And just overall, 42 of their 55 wins have been by double figures, and 12 of those have been by 20 points or more. I mean, the 20-point wins, the 30-point wins, even a 40-point win against the Portland Trail Blazers earlier this year. 23-1 in games when they're shooting 50% or better, which most teams, you're going to have a good record if you're shooting 50% or better. But 23-1 for the Bucks to have done that. And Giannis continuing to be a double-double machine, leading the league with double-doubles, or with not just double-doubles, leading the league when he has double-doubles with 25 points or more, 25 or more, and 10 or more rebounds. He has the most of that in the NBA this season. But really, I thought what was most encouraging for the Bucks on Sunday, and I'm sure we will hear Coach Budenholzer address this, the play of George Hill and what George Hill did for this team in that game. A high with the Bucks, 17 points. And when we touched on some of the defensive drop-off that this team had for a bit of a stretch there after the All-Star break, that really aligned with the injury to George Hill. And not only George Hill, but to not have George Hill, no Sterling Brown either. Those were 2 very big parts of your second unit. And that was, you bring in Nico, you had to find minutes somewhere. It was at DJ Wilson's expense. You think back to December and January when that second unit was so strong for the Bucks, and defensively when the Bucks really started to take off after that game against the Knicks on December 1st. Those 3 players were as big as anyone in the success that the Bucks had there in that regard. So to get them back has been huge, and I'm sure that's something you heard Coach Bud asked about after the game on Sunday. I'm sure it's something he will be asked about once again tonight here as the Bucks get set to take on the Houston Rockets. Big game here, national TV broadcast on TNT, Giannis versus James Harden. So 2 big matchups with the Rockets this season, both national games. An ESPN game the first time around earlier this season, TNT today. But just to wrap things up on George Hill as we wait for Coach Budenholzer, 17 points from George Hill. The defense, the communication, all of that, you've never questioned any of that, and George Hill has brought that game in, game out. We've heard Coach Bud talk about that numerous times this season. But what's most impressive and really what's biggest for this team is you saw the shots start to fall, and it seems like George Hill is starting to heat up offensively, which will be big for the postseason. Here's Coach Budenholzer.
Obviously, the other night you mentioned that Tony's turned his ankle pretty bad, and he's not playing tonight. Is there any expectation that it's going to be an extended period of time that you guys will be without him?
How do you define extended period of time?
Do you think he'll be back in time for the playoffs?
Yes.
Thinking a little bit back to that last Rockets game, I know we talked to Bled about it a little bit this morning, but you guys had planned to, push Harden a certain way, and then Bled exaggerated it a little bit. Just what goes into the talk with him tonight about how you prepare for Harden and, what you want him to try to do there?
We'll see what Bled does tonight. I mean, it's been it's been a great year to work with Bled and just kind of, hopefully just learn about him and give him some freedom and opportunities to, just take advantage of his special skills defensively. And so, I'm sure Harden will be, smarter. I think we're not the only team that's kind of tried some similar things, and I think it's the group around, whoever it is, Bled or George or Chris or Sterling, takes everybody kind of participating. So, but it's good to have some experience, have some film to watch sometimes where we could do it better, sometimes where we had some success. So, but I think Bled and Brooke have a very good working relationship. It's really about those two guys.
Last time, obviously, Chris Paul wasn't there. So in terms of sort of following on from that question, I guess, how does that change with them having another guy that perhaps last time it was a little easier to predict who was going to have the ball for the majority of the time?
Well, certainly. I mean, Chris Paul's a great player. It gives them another guy who can kind of take some of the workload off of Harden, especially when he's out, but including when he's in. And, then, we've been guarding lots of good players all year, and he's just, another one of them we got to be prepared for. And if the ball's in his hands, then, we'll guard him.
Tony had started the last 2 games in place of Malcolm, and it was Nico before that, and then he went down. Is it sort of the next man up, and who is the next man up for that starting spot?
Sterling's going to start tonight. So, that spot does feel like we haven't been able to have somebody for a stretch of games. So hopefully, Sterling can, and really just the whole group, we can stay healthy and, settle in a little bit.
Did anyone turn it down beforehand?
Yeah, I was thinking about making a joke about that, but I passed. So, no.
Just thinking about Brooke and that partnership you mentioned, Capella's 4 of 16 last game. It felt like Brooke has, as the season's gone on, gotten really good at playing that in-between spot. Just what has he meant to what you guys do kind of as a whole this season?
Yeah, I mean, it's, between, Bled kind of at the point of it and Bled at the back of it. Like, it's just, and then I think everybody else has been really good too. But to have that backline guy that can just really be so disruptive at the rim. I think he takes up a lot of space on the boards, allows, he gets his fair share, but, Giannis and everybody else gets a ton of them too. And, like I said, there's other teams that have done similar things, and I think, Brooks' uniqueness there gives, feels like you have a fighting chance.
Mike over here.
Yep.
Sorry. With all the injuries that you guys have had over these last 2-3 weeks, it's natural, I think, for the coaches always say that it's everybody's job to kind of do a little bit more. It's never on one guy. But when you have a guy like Giannis, is it sort of in a player like that? Is it in his DNA to do more? And do you expect him, as you guys ramp in the playoffs, to keep doing more and more?
I mean, Giannis, He's kind of unique or pretty amazing what he does night in and night out. To say he's just going to decide to do more, it doesn't seem fair to Giannis or realistic. I think the way I would think of it is that because Giannis does so much, kind of in your question, the other guys I think can fill roles and can, feed off of him and hopefully get open shots offensively and play together defensively. If Giannis needs to do more, I think he will, but I don't think that's, I can't speak for Giannis, but it's not kind of our mindset to ask Giannis to do even more than he already is. And we tend to take what the game gives us, and Giannis takes what the game gives him, and it's not that complicated. So he'll continue to do that, I think. Great, thanks.
Those the words of Bucks coach Mike Budenholzer as his team gets set to take on the Houston Rockets tonight at Fiserv Forum, a MVP caliber matchup here with 2 potential MVPs on the floor in Giannis and James Harden of the Houston Rockets. So first things first here, you heard Coach Bud mention it. No Tony Snell tonight after that rolled ankle over the weekend. Sterling Brown gets the starting place of Tony Snell. So Sterling Brown, his first start this season. He did have 4 starts last season, but the first start of the year for Sterling Brown, who is out there now getting loose here. First start of the year for the Bucks. And Sterling Brown's another guy, as we were touching on there with what George Hill has brought to this team as one of those leaders there defensively, the communication that he's brought to the team as well. Sterling Brown, when you got Sterling Brown back in the mix, coming back from that wrist injury, you noticed another tick upward there from that second unit. And just what Sterling does and what he brings to this team, you can see him doing it now. He plays with an edge on both ends of the floor, and you see no fear in his game. He's a guy that attacks the rim. You're watching him do it right now. Can get to the glass, which is a big area that the Bucks, quite frankly, have missed quite a bit with no Malcolm Brogdon. And I think that goes back to George Hill's game on Sunday as well, that we saw George Hill taking it to the basket, which, Bud talked about this after the game too. You got to get a mixture of drives and outside shooting. That's what Malcolm Brogdon did so well. Yes, 50, 40, 90 club that he was shooting 40% from three-point, better than 40% from three-point. But really what certainly all of us around here have recognized with Malcolm Brogdon's game, but maybe those that don't follow this team on a daily basis, what you don't see is Malcolm Brogdon's ability to finish at the rim. Maybe the second best on the team, the way that really those reverse layups, that every time he gets him to go, you think, how does the opponent not have this scouted, knowing this is what Malcolm Brogdon's going to do? So that's really maybe been the biggest loss that the Bucks have had with no Malcolm Brogdon here ever since that injury. So Sterling Brown steps into the mix tonight as your starter, his first start of the season. And, there was that stretch of play, too, before Sterling Brown got injured, where you started to see double-double performances offensively becoming more and more common, that it seemed like Sterling Brown was starting to piece things together and get a lot more comfortable in this system and really give this team big contributions. Again, the trio of him, George Hill, and DJ Wilson, everything they did for the defense, and not necessarily the defensive turnaround for this team because they were a top 10 defense all season, but really from December onward, they went from a top 10 defense to an elite defense, and still the top-rated defense in the NBA. Sterling Brown plays a big role in that. George Hill certainly plays a big role in that. DJ Wilson as well, in what he's given this team, his ability to switch and play multiple positions defensively. Just think back to when DJ Wilson was really thrust into the rotation. Think of all those matchups that DJ Wilson had to go through. Blake Griffin on the road in Detroit in those games against the Pistons. Here at home, you go back to that game against the Pelicans when DJ Wilson was stuck on Anthony Davis. We've seen him matched up with Joel Embiid, a handful of other guys, perimeter and in the low post. That's what he has the ability to do and give you. So that trio, to have them back, to have them starting to click now, and health, as important as that has been, as we've touched on numerous times, this team has hit a bad stretch of really gone through a stretch of bad luck with their health. But to get those three guys, especially George Hill and Sterling Brown, who are battling with the injuries, to get them all healthy right now as you head to the postseason has been big. And, as we mentioned, too, the big offensive performance from George Hill, the 17 points that he scored on Sunday in the victory, his high in a Bucks uniform, he just looks overall more and more confident and comfortable offensively for this Bucks team now the last few weeks. And ever since his return from injury, where George Hill kind of embraced the role of the bench leader and the guy that was the communicator out there, leading the defense, making sure everybody was in the right positions. That was his role. That was what he really thrived at and did very well for this team. But now what you've seen from him recently, it looks more and more like the shots are starting to fall for him. The performances that he's given you offensively, 17 again against the Cavs, his former team over the weekend. He had 8 against the Heat on Friday night. He's starting to hit more outside shots as well, which is another area where this team has ticked upward too, with Pat Connaughton starting to connect more and more for three-pointers. The Bucks actually have 4 players this month shooting 40% or better from three-point. Now, one of those we're not going to see again this month in Malcolm Brogdon, but you've had Brogdon better than 40%. Chris Middleton, we gave you the numbers just a couple of moments ago. Chris Middleton better than 40%. Pat Connaughton better than 40%. And Brook Lopez all better than 40% from three-point this season. So three-point shots starting to fall. The second unit starting to really put it together here and get healthy, where maybe you're getting some injuries elsewhere. And I know we say that knowing that Tony Snell won't play tonight. But now you're starting to get more and more health, because think back to where this team was when Nico went down and you were still battling those injuries to Sterling Brown, to George Hill. Tim Frazier was a necessity because of the injuries in the backcourt. So the major ones you're still working through, but you're starting to get those minor ones out of the way and to get more and more healthy, which will be big for this team as you move into the final few weeks of the regular season. Final 8 games here and a magic number of 4 that they have to wrap up the top seed in the Eastern Conference. And when they do that, it will be the top seed in all of the NBA, given they're further in front of the Toronto Raptors than they are the Golden State Warriors right now for top record in basketball. Interesting to point out here is we've just been handed by Ted Davis. Sterling Brown gets the start tonight, a season-high 13 against the Houston Rockets in that win in early January. And, again, just go back to that game and the 116-109 victory where at the time of that, a lot of the talk was the defense that the Bucks played on James Harden and the job they did on him defensively, which if you look at the final score, the final box, and you see James Harden scored 42 points in that game, at first blush, that may be something hard to believe. But James Harden played 41 minutes, 13 of 30 from the field, 6 of 16 from three-point. But really what jumped out to me, only 11 free throws, which you say only, still double digits. But for a player like James Harden, the amount of free throws he has taken this season, really the last 3 seasons, only 11 free throws in that game. Clint Capella actually ended up taking more free throws than James Harden in the game. But the 11 free throws, to me, points out exactly what we were talking about and the defensive plan that they had coming into that game with how to defend Harden, to put Bledsoe out there on the perimeter to basically shadow James Harden, something we've seen Eric Bledsoe really succeed with against a handful of players this season. And to have him out there basically forcing James Harden to his right and playing off to make sure once he gets there, let's just funnel him into the lane where Brook Lopez is going to be there defending the rim and not fouling, because that's really been the biggest thing of James Harden's game. The step-back three-pointer certainly gets most of the attention, but James Harden's ability to get to the free throw line and basically converting free points there has been huge offensively. The Bucks did a tremendous job of avoiding that back in early January in that victory, beating the Rockets 116-109 on the road. And James Harden with the big game with 42 points. But Giannis had a 20-20, let's not forget, in that game as well. 27 points, 21 rebounds, 5 assists. Sterling Brown, as we just told you, 13 points, a season high, 3 of 8 three-pointers in that game. A couple of double-digit performances. Ersan with a strong game against the Rockets as well, 10 points and 7 boards, the strong play from Ersan Ilyasova in that victory, and 24 from Malcolm Brogdon, too. So Eric Bledsoe was your defensive guy. You didn't really look for the offense from him there. The job for Eric Bledsoe and Brook Lopez, who combined for 17 points, their job and their ask was more defensively, and I think they really thrived there. Even though James Harden put up 42 points in that game, still a strong defensive effort from the Bucks in that victory. So with that, just heard from Coach Mike Budenholzer and some of his comments there on basically what we just mentioned there, and everything we saw in this first matchup between these two teams back in January was a team effort defensively, not just on James Harden now, but tonight, factor this in as well. Tonight you have to worry about Chris Paul, who did not play in that first matchup. So it's going to be a team effort defensively. Based on everything the coach said there, I would imagine more of the same game plan against the Rockets tonight that you saw against them January 5, where you're going to have that duo of Eric Bledsoe and Brook Lopez kind of teaming up. Bledsoe defending the perimeter and funneling James Harden into the paint, where Brook Lopez is there waiting to defend the rim. So a team effort, and that's going to extend to Chris Paul as well, who we mentioned didn't play in the first matchup between these two teams this season. Austin Rivers instead got the start for the Rockets, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the next thing that he was asked about with Chris Paul playing tonight. It's a Bucks team, though, that has played, and really when we say the Bucks as a team, this is Eric Bledsoe, have played a lot of tough point guards this season. Certainly you're going to play all of them, but just looking at what Eric Bledsoe has done, and go back to early this season when I think we all started to take note of Eric Bledsoe's defense, I guess you would say. We knew what level Eric Bledsoe brings defensively, but to see this year, early this season, when it really ticked upward, that stretch earlier this season when he had to go through a lot of really premier guys in the backcourt. Opening night against Kemba Walker, tasked at times with defending Victor Oladipo just a couple of nights later. Ben Simmons in the Philadelphia 76ers. Kyle Lowry just a couple of games later. Kyrie Irving, Damian Lillard, and Steph Curry back-to-back performances on that road trip. And the job he did against those two players, limiting their point production, especially against Steph Curry in that big victory on the road in Golden State. And really the rookie Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as well. Same road trip there. And Jamal Murray, where 4 really good, young, tough point guards. And Eric Bledsoe has been up to the call every time. He's answered the call every time, we should say. So certainly nothing new here. And Eric Bledsoe's defense going to be big tonight. But, as we just got done saying, Sterling Brown and what he's brought to this defense, offensively and defensively, the edge that he plays with certainly is going to be something that the Bucks need tonight from that backcourt duo of both James Harden and Chris Paul. You look at the jobs that Sterling Brown has done and that certainly Eric Bledsoe has done all season long. They're going to have their hands full tonight, but I would expect to see very much of the same here from the Bucks against that duo of James Harden and Chris Paul. Again, we welcome your interaction here on Facebook. You can tweet them in as well. MVP Showdown, a lot of the comments chiming in for that. A couple of DJ Wilson fans excited to see DJ out there on the floor as well in a matchup that's certainly everybody very excited about to see these two, not only teams, but these two MVP candidates going head-to-head in James Harden and Giannis Antetokounmpo. The debate certainly raging on Facebook as to who is going to win the award, who is going to win the game. And once again, as we've seen all season long here with Bucks Courtside Live, what stands out to you the most is just the international appeal of certainly Giannis, but this Milwaukee Bucks team as well. The number of fans out there viewing along with us coming from all over the globe, not just the country here. Something that really never gets old seeing here, the long-ranging appeal of this Milwaukee Bucks team. So I gave you those numbers about Chris Middleton and what he's done a couple of different segments since the All-Star break, season overall, but really since the injury to Malcolm Brogdon as well, when Chris Middleton has been called upon to do much more here for this offense, and the dominance of this Bucks offense, this Bucks team, overall, offensively and defensively, what they've done here. 55 wins, 42 of those by double figures, 14-2 against the Central Division, too. That is their best record within the division in franchise history. Neither of those two losses here at home. Those two losses to the Cavs last week in a game when the Bucks basically had no one available, and earlier this season on the road against the Indiana Pacers. So those were your two losses against the division. The record when you're shooting 50% or better, 23-1 this season. And when they outshoot their opponents, 53-2 in their 55 wins this season. If they outshoot them, 53-2, only 2 times have they outshot the opponents and lost the game. So all of that pointed to the dominance, but a couple of other things I want to point to is Eric Name will join us here momentarily. Entering the game tonight, the Bucks net rating is 9.1. Point that out because, and I know we've mentioned net rating on this show quite a bit, and just to run through it, for those of you viewing that don't know what it is, net rating, as simple as it sounds, your offensive rating minus your defensive rating. What that number is, that's your net rating. A 9.1 net rating for the Bucks this season. Since 1997, 11 teams have had a net rating of 9 or better. 8 of those teams played in the NBA Finals. 7 won the championship. So that's where the Bucks are at right now. That's the company that they're in, that if they finish at 9 or better, they will be the 12th team to do that in nearly 25 years. And again, 8 times you've reached the finals, so potential for that being 9 times or more. Joining us now from The Athletic, we welcome in my favorite guest to do this show.
Wow, laying it on thick.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to do it every time that there's a guest on, so take no offense, but
everyone is your favorite guest?
Thursday, unless you want to do it again Thursday. Thursday's guest will also be my favorite.
Wow. I guess that's one way out of it.
Yeah. I was just so. I guess let's start with what Bud said. We know Sterling Brown gets the start tonight. Was it you that asked if he turned it down because we saw Nico there, he gets hurt, then Tony Snell gets hurt. Is this a cursed position?
No, I mean there at least has to be the theory thrown out, right? Like there's at least a possibility that it's a cursed spot in the starting line. I'm obviously joking, but Bud did say he thought about making that joke and then ultimately decided against it. So I'm pretty sure he's judging me for making that joke, but that's okay. There'll be water on the bridge. We'll be fine.
Sterling, you can say no, but we'd like you to start tonight. Just open it with that.
I know you don't have a lot of career starts, but it's up to you. If you want to turn it down, we totally understand.
I was just talking about, too, the game that these two teams played in January. I know you talked about him, Matt Velasquez. Everyone that covers this team talked about the job that the Bucks did defensively on James Harden. And if you didn't watch the game, you just look at the box score and you say, well, 42 points. How do they play that well? But look at the overall numbers, what James Harden shot from the field. And to me, this kind of goes hand in hand with the way that they schemed the defense to have Bledsoe kind of funnel him into the lane to Brook Lopez. James Harden, and I know this might, again, seem like a lot, but James Harden only took 11 free throws in that game.
No, it was funny. I started a question to Mike D'Antoni about the defense just a few minutes ago. And he goes, oh, yeah, they really slowed him down that night. 42, I think he had a triple-double. Yeah. And, of course, that's what I would expect from, someone who coaches James Harden. I think it's pretty much impossible to actually make him have a bad game. Like, that's just not something that he does. And, I think it's very similar to when we talk about Giannis having a bad game. Like, okay, that bad game that he had, 95% of the league, that would be their best night. Like, that's just the level that these guys are at. But I do think it is interesting to kind of think through exactly what you're doing with James Harden, how you can make things difficult. And, the thing I was talking to with Bledsoe is that, and I talked to him about this at the start of the year, but he always is worried about guys' tendencies. He's thinking about what do these guys like. And he knows that Harden likes to pull up three, and he likes to pull up three on the step back on his left hand. Like, he knows that. Like, so that's the shot that he likes. So if I can keep him from that, I'm going to make him do something he doesn't want to do. Now, James Harden is one of the most skilled offensive players in the league today, and maybe one of the most offensively skilled players in the history of the game. So he'll be just fine without that. But what it turns into is essentially what Bledsoe likes to say is you're speeding him up. You're turning him into doing something he doesn't want to do because he's going to see his right-hand drive wide open, and you'd be an idiot to turn that down. Like, it's obvious, go take it. But what that turns into is a lot of in-between shots. If you're on the left hand, that means he's got to shoot with his right hand. That means he's got to throw the lob with his right hand. That means all those things are going to be just slightly worse. They're not going to be terrible because he's incredibly gifted, but they're going to be slightly worse. So when you look at Harden for that game, 9 turnovers. Like, the reason there are 9 turnovers is because you're getting him into a spot he doesn't want to do. Passes aren't quite as accurate. That means Brook Lopez has a second longer. That means Giannis has a second longer. That means all those guys have a little bit longer to react, or, maybe the ball's 5 inches closer to them than it should be, and all of a sudden they can get a tip. And, I just thought that was kind of what that game was about, was speeding him up, making him do something he doesn't want to do. And sure, he still goes off. There's no doubt about that, but you're putting him in a spot that he doesn't want to be.
Sterling Brown gets the start tonight, as we pointed to. So his first start of the season, 4 starts last year, which I guess I don't remember those. But 4 starts last year for Sterling Brown. But the question was also brought up of, we talk about the defense you did on James Harden. Chris Paul didn't play in that game. Chris Paul will play tonight. But what Sterling Brown has brought to this team, and, he's another guy that I think when you watch him play, the box score doesn't really quantify everything that he's done. But just other than Giannis, I can't think of another player on this team that plays with an edge like Sterling Brown. And I think, this matchup with the backcourt of Chris Paul and James Harden, now Sterling Brown and Eric Bledsoe being asked to slow that duo down, I think this is something he really thrives with.
No, it's funny. I think I called it, I'm trying to think, I think I called it a physicality and an edge, and Bud says the word that he likes to use for that, and what that is and what Sterling does is toughness. Yeah. And, I think it's dead on. And, you think back to this weekend, his first game back after he had missed all these games, and the second possession, he's playing defensively. Dwayne Wade has the ball over here on the left wing, and Sterling Brown doesn't just go out to go get him. He goes out clapping his hands, ready to go. That's a Hall of Famer. That is Dwayne Wade. Like his number right up there.
Yeah.
Like that hangs here in 5-star form. Like he is here. So like that is the type of player you're talking about when you think through all of the things that Sterling Brown has done. It is that physicality. It is that edge. One of his most memorable games last year against the Houston Rockets.
Yeah.
And what was he doing? He was in Chris Paul's face talking junk to Chris Paul. And again, like Mike Budenholzer's been able to curb that back, and he said that's a big thing with Sterling is that we want that physicality, we want that edge, but we can't have the fouls. And last year you really did have that. It was very physical, but he was fouling a lot, and that's just not something you can have from a bench guy. So they've been able to curb that, but it's the same idea of just being fearless and just being able to go at anyone. He does not care. Like last year it was John Wall and Chris Paul in two of his more famous games. This year it was thinking back to in Detroit against Blake Griffin. Blake Griffin, power forward, that's fine. I'll take it. I'm just fine. And that's just kind of Sterling Brown's approach. So it doesn't matter if it's a Hall of Famer like Chris Paul, like Dwayne Wade. It doesn't matter if it's a multi-time All-Star. It doesn't matter who it is. Like Sterling Brown is going to go up there, have that edge, have that physicality, and he's definitely going to be talking.
You talk about the fouls last year, and that's really an interesting thing because coming into the season, I think that was one of the things we all kind of wondered, okay, what's this defensive philosophy of Bud? We know how the Spurs did things, but this is a team that fouls a lot. We have mentioned nothing about fouls this year with the Bucks defense.
I just remember talking to Bud about this in the preseason because, you look at Bud teams over the years, they're dead last in free throw rate as well in Atlanta, or second because the Spurs were there as well. So Pop and Bud kind of competing for who's going to foul the least. But one thing that I mentioned was, in the preseason we had all the hand check rules and that being an emphasis. And I was like, how do you kind of try to work through trying to foul less in, the hardest time for that as they're calling more fouls than they normally call. Like, they're trying to emphasize this, and you have a team that fouled more than just about anyone else in the league last year. Like, it feels like you're just piling all this stuff up, and, it was pretty typical, but he just, kind of looked at me and was like, we'll just tell them not to foul. Like, don't foul. Like, play defense without fouling. Like, that's what we'll tell them. And I was just like, yeah, I get it, but it's not that simple. Like that's a really hard thing to do, especially when you think of that Bucks defense for the last couple of years. They'd gotten into some really bad habits, and they were reaching a lot, and they'd get themselves out of position, overcommit, overhelp, and then all of a sudden, as they're recovering, it was just a foul, so they won't give up any easy layups, but also they were giving up easy layups, and they're giving up a bunch of free throws. So it has been a huge adjustment, and it's really impressive stuff.
Was it you we were talking about this with, but what David Thorpe will say a lot about coaching and the impact that can have. Guys like Giannis are going to become superstars regardless of who it is coaching them. But one guy we mentioned a lot, Sterling Brown, and DJ Wilson, probably the other big benefactor. You look at what good coaching can do for those two guys. I mean, DJ Wilson especially, considering what the expectations were coming into this season and what he's given you. To me, that's really, if you point to the success of the Bucks this season, what Giannis is doing, sure, that's great. The wins, all of that is great. But the job of guys like that and how they've really embraced their roles and the production that they've given you is what jumps out most to me.
Yeah, I know I told a number of Bucks fans this last year, and they didn't really like this answer. But, I said, look at bad teams and look at poorly coached teams. How many good role players do you see on those teams? You don't, because that's just it's not possible to be a good role player when either you're fundamentally flawed in some way because of poor coaching or you just don't have enough talent. Yeah. Like, it's difficult to be a good role player in those spots. And, a lot of people are like, oh, well, like you should be able to, get the most, like it's energy, it's effort, it's being able to compete defensively. And it's like, well, if the team as a whole doesn't do those things well, like how is this person that, most of the time with a role player, that means you don't have star level talent. Like, they need all of the things to be right in the ecosystem. They need everything around them to be correct so that when they get in, they know that they can do things a certain way and it's going to have success. And I think last year that wasn't something that existed here in Milwaukee, and I think this year it very clearly exists. Like, you're just seeing role players that can just step in and do what they need to do.
And, certainly not a role player, but Malcolm Brogdon, too, that, you look at what he's done this season with the 50, 40, 90, all the other numbers. Malcolm Brogdon's a guy that I think you've gotten every last drop out of this season in terms of the efficiency, all of it. And a lot of that is the credit to coaching. With that, the injury to Malcolm Brogdon, you knew you were going to have to get production elsewhere. And what was big was, I think you've mentioned this a handful of times too, replacing Malcolm Brogdon. It's not just the shooting, but Malcolm Brogdon was maybe their second best finisher at the rim on this team. So getting those drives, what George Hill gave you Sunday is certainly very encouraging. And even more than Sunday, he was very good in the game against Miami too. But if he can be healthy and playing at that level as you move to the postseason, that's going to be huge for this team.
I think it's fascinating to listen to George Hill kind of talk through this, because there's a couple games that stick out to me this year with George Hill. And one that goes to my mind right away is Indiana right before the All-Star break. There's that third quarter stretch where he rattles out, I can't remember if it's 7 or 8 now, but it was 3 buckets and, maybe a free throw or something like that. He rattles those off, and it keeps them in the game. That was what they needed at that moment. Obviously, Giannis and Chris kind of closed it down the stretch. But after that game, we talked with Bud a little bit, and he mentioned, we need him to be aggressive. We need George to be attacking and remembering that, he's a very gifted scorer, and that's kind of what we need. And obviously, Hill gets hurt very shortly after the All-Star break. That whole conversation, that whole game just goes out of your mind. And then, you see these last 2 games, and that's sort of back. And talking with George Hill about it, the one thing he has said is that when you get traded to the best team in the league, you're not thinking about, oh, there's going to be all this opportunity for me, or I'm going to make this team so much better. All you're thinking about is, don't screw this up.
How do I fit in?
Because if I get traded here and I'm the new guy and they start to play bad, well, the only thing that changes is the new guy. So then I must be the one that's doing something wrong. And, as he's talked through it, he's kind of mentioned, that means, make the right pass, do the right thing defensively, hit an open shot if I get it. But none of those things mention being aggressive, attacking, trying to, maybe do a little bit extra just because you're talented enough to do so, but you're a little bit worried. You want to fit in, so you're not trying to do too much. And, I think as you watch George Hill, this is the guy that's scored close to 20 points per game multiple seasons in his career. You think back to him in Indiana, you think back to him in Utah. I mean, even on that Cleveland team, there were stretches last year when he was healthy that he was really helpful for a team that goes deep into the playoffs. So, I think for him, it's partially remembering I'm not just a bit player. Like, I am a very good basketball player. I'm a very talented basketball player. And the reason they traded for me is because I am those things. Not just because I fit into the same salary spot as Henson and Daly. Like, I am actually a talented basketball player that they trust and know can do something. And it's going to be really interesting to see if in, the next couple of weeks he kind of remembers that. And obviously you want to try to get to the second round, get Malcolm Brogdon back. But in that time, can he fill that role?
What, if anything, have you seen differently from Chris Middleton? Because since the All-Star break, we've seen the numbers start to tick upward, but also, since the Malcolm Brogdon injury, and part of it may be, look, we need to get the production from other guys. Chris Middleton's numbers have gone up even more so. And the thing I always mention, too, is the whole Chris Middleton thing has really been one of the main talking points this season. But I think last April you saw what he's capable of doing. If you look at this team, with 5 starters who are capable of scoring 20 on a nightly basis, you can't deny that Chris Middleton has been asked to take a bit of a step back. So now, when you need more, you're seeing more.
I mean, I think with Chris, this is part of the reason why there's always people wondering if he's a true number 2 or whatever that conversation is. And it's a conversation I find largely ridiculous and arbitrary because you're just making up guidelines for what a number 2 is. But that's beside the point. So what I think keeps people thinking that he isn't that thing or he isn't exactly what they want, I think the big thing is that he is willing to defer.
Yeah.
They see him start the first quarter, find his rhythm, and then he won't go out of his way to get shots. He will go out of his way to make sure everyone else is involved. He'll make sure to get Giannis going in the pick and roll. He probably overpasses in the pick and roll with Giannis a little bit, but he knows just how much a Giannis slam means to the momentum, to how the other defense is feeling, and obviously to Giannis, the team's best player. And then, you think about Malcolm Brogdon. He likes to attack off the dribble. Sometimes it's early in possessions. That takes away a possession from Chris Middleton. Same thing with Eric Bledsoe. And for him, I just think so often he doesn't go out of his way to say, you know what, I got it going. I'm going to keep it going. This is just going to be me. And again, some people will say, well, then that means you're just not good enough. You don't have it. But obviously, we saw the playoffs last year. He does have it. So he can do that. But I think kind of what has made him an analytics darling over the years is just that he's going to do what he needs to do. He's going to get you some assists. He's going to get some other guys involved. And he's going to make the team play better, period. That's just how it is. And he's not worried about himself. And I think what you've seen in the last couple games with Malcolm out, he started to think through, okay, I can look for myself a little bit. I can get myself going a little bit. And, I think that can be really big for him. And obviously it just shows that he can play in just a number of different ways.
The last thing I'll leave you with here is we're getting set for the Bucks and the Rockets. You can follow it nationally on TNT and obviously on the radio on the Bucks Radio Network. Right now, net rating for the Bucks is 9.1. In the nearly last 25 years, since 97, 11 teams have finished 9 or better. 8 of those 11 played in the finals, 7 won a championship. That's the neighborhood the Bucks not only are in right now. There was a stretch for a couple of weeks, the last few weeks, where they were a little below 9, but they've been in that neighborhood all season long. We can point to the historically great season Giannis is having, but numbers like that, the point differential, you can find 5 to 10 of these to point out and say, this is why the Bucks we're talking about as a finals favorite and why they have been historically good this season.
They are undeniably historically good. There's just no way around it. And again, the close number or the close game data can kind of screw things up a little bit. Maybe they won't end up having quite as many wins as you want, but there's a good chance this team ends with 60 wins at the end of the season. And I think just saying that number means pretty elite company. And then you add in all of the net rating, the point differential, all of that adds up. Tom Habistro the other day had a stat that of 10-plus point wins, the Bucks have 40-plus. There isn't anyone above 30. That's kind of what they're doing. They aren't just beating teams; they're destroying teams. And obviously that can hurt Giannis's MVP chances because he's not playing as much. I talked with him about that at the Athletic today. That he's just like, I want to play more, man. And it's like, well, you don't need to when you're doing that. And that's kind of been the story of the season, is that they've just been so good. And people will use that as, oh, well, that means they're not going to be great in close games or whatever else. There will always be something, but their numbers, their statistical profile is undeniable, and the number of wins that they have this year, the best record in the NBA, is undeniable as well.
Before we sign off, for your first year traveling around following the team, how great does the last few weeks look where you have 3 straight at home, and the first 2 in the playoffs are going to be at home? You're going to have 2.5 weeks at home.
It's not going to be bad, I'll tell you that. I'm excited. It's getting a little bit sunnier outside, a little bit warmer weather. I've heard that maybe there's some snow coming around. Hopefully it doesn't. But either way, I'll be happy to be at home and just hang out. And it's gonna be really nice. And I mean, the tough part will be the basketball might not be as meaningful because the Bucks their magic number is 4. That might get done, I don't know, in the next week or so. It depends how much the Raptors lose. So there could be some not as meaningful basketball down the end, but that's okay.
Certainly a welcome change,
right?
From what we've seen.
I mean, the way that it's meaningless is the thing that changes. At times things weren't going so well, and April meant some bad basketball for just being out of the playoff race. This is the exact opposite. You're so far in the playoff race and done so well that maybe the last couple games don't mean much.
This was the first time where you weren't looking forward to the All-Star break to see, hey, what are our guys going to do? You had the captain and you had Chris Middleton on a big game, but You were probably looking like, all right, let's get this All-Star break over. Let's get going again here.
No, absolutely. I think that's the funny thing about this season is that, I remember talking to Chris before the All-Star break, and, they had already beat the Raptors, and they were already the #1 team, and they had all these wins stacked up, and it was just like, does it already feel like you don't have all that much more to prove and you just need to get to the playoffs? And he was like, yeah, kind of. And it was like, that's crazy to say, like, around the All-Star break. Again, that's not the halfway point. It's the 2/3 point. But still, 2/3 of the way through the season to be like, yeah, I don't know how much we have left to prove in the regular season. That's saying something. That is saying something about the type of basketball you're playing.
He is Eric Name of The Athletic, and it's the Bucks and the Rockets MVP showdown between Giannis and James Harden. You can follow the game on TNT and, of course, statewide on the Bucks Radio Network. 7 o'clock tip-off, 6:30 is when we begin on the Bucks Radio Network. Another episode of Bucks Courtside in the books. We're back Thursday night when the Bucks host the Los Angeles Clippers. We'll talk to you then on Bucks Courtside Live.